Everyone, this is Mike Wise with the Boston Blockchain Association. Welcome to the vidcast. I'm so excited. So we have a very interesting panel on tap for tonight to talk about regulatory nodes. So I'm just going to share my screen and walk through a few slides. So tonight we have a illustrious panel: Jim Cunha, SVP with the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston; Sarah Biller, the widely regarded queen of Boston FinTech and executive director of Vantage Ventures; John Beccia, who has started a consultancy around blockchain and legal and regulatory, former chief legal officer with Circle; and Chuck Senator, our moderator, who hails from Fidelity and is on the board of Fidelity Digital Assets. So welcome to our session tonight. So the Boston Blockchain Association is a community of innovators, collaborators, and entrepreneurs excited about the promise of blockchain technologies. We're building Boston into the global hub of blockchain. If you're sharing on social media, please use the hashtag Boston Blockchain. We've got a threefold mission: to establish Greater Boston as an international hub for blockchain innovation, to support, educate, promote, and advance blockchain technology as a whole, and to support and connect entrepreneurs with useful resources. BostonBlockchainAssociation.com. There will be a button on the bottom of your screen where you can join. This is a member-driven organization, so we are always looking for people to join. Here are some of our corporate members: Algorand, Bellumi, Consensus, Fabric, PureStake, Northern Bank, Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and Media Shower. Thanks to our corporate members and sponsors. Couple announcements: PureStake is hiring right now. These are some of their jobs. You can find those on the jobs page on Boston Blockchain Association or on PureStake's site. I also know that AidX is looking for a blockchain developer, so there's another job opportunity as well. Some of the things that are happening in Boston right now: Fidelity, the president of Fidelity, have filed for a Bitcoin fund. Big news last week was USDC on Algorand. So that's right in the wheelhouse of Boston Blockchain. USDC, of course, is the stablecoin founded by Circle and Center, and Boston-based company, and Algorand is the Boston-based protocol. That's just awesome. So that's really big news. I'd encourage you to look into USDC on Algorand. And then, of course, big news from a couple weeks ago was the Boston Fed joining into an exploratory research project with MIT around CBDC, and I'm sure that will come up tonight. So speaking of that, we have Jim Cunha, who sits right in the wheelhouse of that project. Jim's been with the Federal Reserve Bank Boston for a long time. I always characterize Jim as a regulator that is blockchain friendly. So you can find Jim on LinkedIn. We also have John Beccia, who was formerly, as I said before, the chief counsel for Circle. Has a very distinguished past and present. So John Beccia, so glad to have you on the team. And then Sarah Biller. Sarah's been in the FinTech space in Boston for a long time. She's working on a lot of different things. We're so glad that she could join us. And then lastly, Chuck Senator, who has been doing a lot of work in this space. Big background with Fidelity, and he leads the Boston Reg Tech meetup. So perfect person to serve as moderator. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Chuck Senator Chuck, would you like to introduce yourself and then take it from there?
Great, thanks, Mike. You know, this is going to be quite a discussion today. Regulatory nodes are cool. Zero knowledge proofs are cool. CBDC is cool. But there are a couple of things we need to sort of think about tonight. And one of the things to consider here is that, not surprisingly, blockchain developments are not standing still. Innovation continues at the speed of light. Just this month, the Bahamas is moving forward with issuing a central bank digital currency. I love the name. It's called the Sand Dollar. And I guess they're starting off a little bit in a modest way with $48,000 worth. But you know what? It's the first move. They're ahead of China. China's still marching on toward digitizing the RMB, looking at early to 2022. And as Mike points out, our own Jim Cunha here in the flesh and online is doing research with MIT on a central bank digital currency prototype for the US. The point is, not surprisingly, that innovation is accelerating. And the landscape is primed for opportunities for unleashing better transparency for regulators and market participants. The idea of more collaboration and sharing, I mean, even just within the last month, FinCEN has put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which, among other things, specifically calls out the need for more sharing of information among market participants. And when we talk about the regulatory nodes, you'll see how that kind of fits in. And last but not least, the paving the way for instant and immediate execution of transactions. But as cool as all of that is, we do also plan on touching on a foundational question, which really should be at the center of many of our thoughts when we think about innovation. How will these steps improve the lot of investors, large and small? Can the benefits of markets do better? Can they do a better job at reaching more of us and broadening opportunity? And most of all, how will this create trust? Trust in the markets, trust that there will be a better outcome, and trust that friction will be reduced and access to opportunity for all will grow. So we'll be going down the road with a lot of interesting issues. And what I'd like to do is sort of start off by going to my friend Jim Cunha and tell us a little bit about regulatory nodes. Let's start simple. What are they? And what's the idea behind them, Jim?
Yeah, so thanks, Chuck. When I talk about regulatory nodes, I think about it very generally. So I'm not necessarily just talking about, say, the Federal Reserve as a regulator. It could be a regulator. It could be a rules enforcer of some kind. It could be an external accounting firm who needs to ensure compliance with certain things in the network. So it's really anybody who has the need to have eyes on a network that's not really part of it. It could be to make sure that the rules are being followed. It could be to look for the aggregate risk of a particular network. So it's really to have real-time eyes on, as opposed to what normally happens, which is you get reports after the fact and you spend a lot of time looking at what happened days, weeks, months ago. So it's a real-time view into a network to help keep it safe.
So what sorts of information would be on a node, and who would be the other nodes, just to sort of complete the picture?
Yeah, so one example I like to point to is, if you're familiar with Finality. Finality is a consortium of some of the largest banks in the world, and they're building a network formerly called Utility Settlement Coin. They're building an interbank transfer network. So they're going to be moving tokens around these, say, 20 banks. And if they're successful, they could be moving trillions of dollars around this particular network. And so that's a lot of money. So you, as a regulator, you may want to know, is the institution that I regulate on this network working in a safe and sound manner? Are there liquidity issues? Are there challenges to safety and soundness for the particular institution? Or with that kind of money, it could be a systemically important network. So you'd want to make sure there's no systemic risk to that particular network or the networks that it feeds. So there's a couple of different purposes. That's one example I like to use because it's really in development, and it's going to be international, which means you're talking about probably 20 different jurisdictions of regulators. So having eyes on that can tell you immediately if there's going to be any liquidity issues, or if you're, say, monitoring State Street Bank, which is part of that consortium, is there anything that's going to potentially hurt their safety soundness? So that's one live example that I think will be evolving over the course of the next couple of years.
Well, you know, we've had instances in the past where having a real-time line of sight into sort of market dislocations could have been really helpful. I know we've talked about, imagine if we would have known in real time that people were leaving Lehman.
Yes.
So I guess what that does is beg a question in terms of, well, we talked a little bit about sort of like the regulators on the node. There could be regulators, that could be regulators from different jurisdictions. What about the banks? What about the State Streets? What's their role, and then what do they have in the node? What sort of information is there, and how is that set up? What kind of information, for example, would be captured on the node that would enable this kind of monitoring of systemic risks to happen?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how finality is going to eventually be evolved. Using these networks, participants don't want to let anybody else see their business. So if you're a large financial institution, you don't necessarily want everybody seeing who you're trading with, who your trading partners are, what kind of money. So I'm not exactly sure what kind of view State Street, for example, could have. But you could see there being rules of the network that say if certain conditions exist, all the participants should be notified of some particular abnormality. So it may just be an exception reporting type of process because, for instance, State Street probably wouldn't want to let Bank New York Mellon and JP Morgan understand their traffic. That's something that's really proprietary to the institutions partnering. But you can think of there being rules where if certain types of conditions exist, liquidity traps or some sort of other external factors, that the parties could be known because it may be the network itself that's monitoring and updating all the participants. It's one example of where it's not a regulator, it's actually a network sort of traffic cop that's helping to watch the network for issues.
So, John, let me flip something to you, because you come from much of a very different perspective, because you were general counsel and CCO at Circle with a firm. So you could ostensibly be a node on the network where the Fed and regulators have a line of sight. So sort of flip it around and sort of react to what the issues might be from someone in your seat if you went back to your days at Circle to assume you're going to be a node on the network. Or what are the things that would sort of grab you, and what would be sort of the things that you'd be thinking about in terms of conditions of being willing to play on this network?
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, first, thanks for putting this panel together, and it's great to see the Boston Blockchain Association. I remember early days of Circle when we were at the beginning stages here, and it's great to see how the ecosystem has evolved. Certainly, you look at Boston really is a hub. When you look at the different companies, you look at the Boston Fed, and then also the universities in the area that are really looking at this and building interesting technology and thinking about it from different perspectives. And, we've come a long way, from a regulatory perspective in terms of, and from a business perspective in terms of how we look at blockchain and nodes and what they can do. And, we've, especially from my position in-house, really it's figuring out how do you harness the technology? How do you make the data work for you and use it? You can use it from a business standpoint. You can use it from a compliance standpoint, certainly. And we have done that quite a bit when you think about things around KYC and understanding your customer, your transaction. You've seen a lot of development in blockchain forensic tools and things like that have really allowed you, for example, to follow the money and follow patterns and the like. Now, the piece from a supervisory perspective, there's a lot of benefit there. And it's not just the Fed. A lot of these institutions are regulated at multiple levels. I have a number of different oversight and supervisory entities, and just the ability for them, all these different agencies to share information, number one, is good. But the question is, how do you develop this and how do you structure it? And whether it's a permission type of blockchain that you're feeding these nodes into or the like, and also what information are you sharing? To Jim's point, in terms of there could be proprietary data, there's issues around privacy. But I mean, from the company's perspective, you have the ability to architect be the architect of this and to really provide a lot of useful information, again, that will not only help you manage risk for you and for what you're trying to do, because at the end of the day, as a regulated institution, you have all these risks that you need to look at, whether it's money laundering, security issues, systemic financial issues. And then the regulator has a similar mission, and they want to have a viewpoint into that. And so it's figuring a way to collaborate and to have these pieces meld in a way that, again, is, the information is shared appropriately, and you have the right amount of information. I'm certain the regulators don't want this big flood of information that isn't actionable, or that's not really giving them the right data points to be able to do their job and to fulfill their mission. So it's really, like anything else within regulation, it's all risk-based, and it's really understanding what it is, an entity's trying to accomplish. And this is the way you look at it on the front end when it's, you license. And then when somebody's in the door, from a supervisory perspective, it's understanding what is the action that's happening, what are the risks involved, and what information do you need to either, from a company perspective, mitigate those risks, or from a supervisory perspective to understand if additional corrective action needs to be made, if they're operating in a safe and sound manner, and if there are other issues and risks.
Let me see if I can just drill down just a touch on that, because my own background, I kind of feel like I have a Sybil complex, because I used to be an SEC regulator, I was an SEC director, but I also ran the global compliance programs for Maryland Fidelity, so I have this kind of tension going on. And on the one hand, my regulator side would like to know as much as I can about what's going on with regulated entities. And it's like, the more information, the better, just bring it over the transom. However, if I, in my role as a compliance officer, I would appreciate what the limits are provided for by law in terms of what you can see and what you can't. So I guess the question is, and I'll open it up to anybody that can start, maybe we'll go to zero knowledge proofs here, but how could we take steps to kind of thread that needle to where the information that's needed for systemic reviewing for systemic risk and other oversight is available, but yet the more sensitive information is sort of held dear. I don't know, Sarah, if you have a view on that. Otherwise, we can just sort of go down the list and get some sense of what the state of play would be.
Yeah, well, Chuck, it's such a fantastic question, because you do have that tension even in your own persona. I certainly feel it as an entrepreneur, and also having been in the innovation side at State Street. And I think about that pool of data, and I'll just, when you think about, let's just use the FDIC for a minute and their supervisory activities. Let's kind of boil it down to a community bank. Every quarter, they're collecting between, just the call reports, nothing else, just the call reports, between 1,200 and 2,400 pieces of data from 5,000 community banks. It is a tremendous tug and pull of data, not only coming out of the institution or the bank, but going into the regulator. And it's always, I've always oftentimes thought about it and applaud Chairman McWilliams for her vision for digitization, mostly because it takes them about 120 days to figure out what's going on at our community banks. If you want to get a pulse on the world, if you want to understand your health, you better not turn around a result in 120 days in today's economy. And so when you talk about data and the construct and what we've heard from both Jim and John, you understand the efficiency and the transparency of the application of these emerging technologies like blockchain, and in particular, their value in regulated entities. We could probably even go on and talk about the cost.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I want to go with the cost, because I think I want to talk about a good thing, which, Sarah, you mentioned that the mountains of data that sort of like community banks that maybe like three guys and a horse, they have to sort of work on all this stuff to sort of get the work, the human effort. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The friction is just unbelievable. So
yeah, just one point, Chuck, to your question, though, I think, Sarah, that example is terrific. And, if you look at depending on what kind of institution you are, if you look at any of the regulatory reporting or public disclosures, you look at SEC filings, 10Ks, 10Qs, you look at call reports, you look at SAR filings, all these types of things, which are, data which is widely reported. Obviously, SAR filings are confidential, but these are all things that you want to know real time, and that's really the key here is real time. And then these are all data points too that are pretty, I wouldn't say generic, but are broad enough that they aren't. It's not as much a competitive issue. It's not as much a proprietary or issue in terms of sharing, and it's also data if it can feed into multiple agencies and multiple stakeholders that can be very useful tools.
So Jim, let me flip something to you, which could actually be, I'm going to like put away my complaining compliance officer persona for a moment.
And put it on me?
No, look, I mean, actually, I remember you, Jim, you've been very clear whenever we've gotten together, you would say, I, Jim Cunha, I'm not a regulator. You're
even though Mike Wise is trying to make me one, right?
Yeah. And I know we like to sort of shift you in there, but let's talk about something that could be a huge benefit. I mean, Sarah was talking about the tug and pull of data, in terms of, and clearly the amount of work, the amount of human effort, the cost, the waste, the friction of this is extraordinary. So, so if you're thinking about the way the nodes are set up, I'm going to presume, but I want to actually ask, is this actually a development that actually dramatically reduces friction in terms of the exchange of data, in terms of the ability to analyze it quickly, and with the ability to kind of see the significance in it in real time, and maybe, just maybe, kind of lessening the burdens of data transmission because it's basically happening in real time. So, Jim, let me flip that to you.
Yeah, and I should have said earlier, these are my thoughts, not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System, our normal disclaimer. But yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right? So everybody will admit that the current process is very cumbersome. It's very intensive, labor intensive. It's slow. That's, it's the nature of what we've built, we being the whole industry over time. But I think that the dual purpose is, one, to get real-time information as opposed to just the lag you'll get through this type of process, but also ease the burden. I mean, every financial institution out there wants us to ease their regulatory burden. So if this can accomplish both, I think there's great possibilities for buy-in by both communities. But also, I mean, we're also not just talking about, data that someone's going to sit and look at a desk, talking about the potential that if these nodes have, AI capabilities and other analytical capabilities, we may be able to even to actually see patterns that the data shows us, but aren't necessarily apparent if you don't, have that analytical engine. So it's not just that they're collecting data and sending it off in a faster form. It also could be that there's intelligence within these nodes that can detect certain abnormalities and certain things. As I said before, this is not just a regulator, but it could be someone who's looking for fraud within a network to find abnormalities real time in a way that could help stop fraud faster, which is also, a major problem. So it's more than just faster, it's also more intelligent and relieving burden on both sides.
Well, a perfect segue, because I actually have a general question that might sort of take this model and apply it in a slightly different fashion. And what I want to sort of put out there, John, I'll throw this to you, is whether the same concept could actually be used. Let's say if you had your auditors on a node, and have sort of real-time review of internal controls, real-time review of like SOC 1, SOC 2 type stuff, real-time sort of weakness, the assessment of weaknesses. What's your thoughts on that, John? You think that's something that could be of value? Just react to it and sort of expand a little bit on what you think that could be.
Yeah, this kind of dovetails to your cost question too. I mean, it's all about, cost and efficiency, and also managing the process in a much better way. I go back to, I spent most of my career in banking, in traditional banking, and any systems we had were pretty much useless, right? And so as you look at the systems that we had to give us insight into, KYC, transaction monitoring, it would generate a bunch of alerts that didn't tell you anything really, and you need to hire a bunch of people to review it. So now, if you are producing information and data, and Jim mentioned, AI tools and machine learning, and what it does is it gives you, and if you can do this through the nodes, I mean, what it does is gives you really a further understanding of who your customers are, what the transactions are, what the risks, what the patterns may be. And, as you mentioned, Chuck, I mean, I think it's important if you can do it real time, and then you can also produce it to these multiple stakeholders. I think from a supervisory perspective, it's interesting. The Conference of State Bank Supervisors just in this week came up with a streamlined examination process. Usually, if you're a money transmitter, you need to have 50 state exams, and I've been through the pain of that. You can imagine the cost and the time to manage through all those exams, pull all that information, appease those, and you're really not giving them much. You're giving them, again, a point-in-time analysis that doesn't tell them. So imagine if you could give that real time, and then you can do it for your auditors. You could do it for things like SOC 1 and 2. And again, it not only, it's not a check the box, or it's not a gotcha exercise. It really helps you as the institution as well, because it gives you this insight to be able to monitor things real time, and hopefully do it in a coordinated fashion.
On that, I know, Sarah, you have many companies under your wing, young companies, small companies, fintechs, emerging unicorns, hopefully. So when you think about particularly a small firm, let's say a small fintech firm, and that firm is might not have the resources of my former firm, Fidelity or Circle or State Street. I just want to sort of do a thought experiment with you. And that thought experiment would be this. So imagine for a moment that there is a paradigm where you could have this sort of, sure, the regulatory node could have a real-time interaction with you, but assuming for the moment that there was a little bit more of an enlightened view of regulation, which I think safety and soundness tends to do because they really sort of care about getting it right. Imagine what it would mean to your firms, the fintechs that you're helping, if they could actually have sort of a virtual dialogue in terms of weaknesses that might be perceived by the regulatory node, and being able to react quickly and able to do so with low cost. Let me let you sort of play with that thought and tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're in the emerging tech space and you sit with entrepreneurs who are on the edge and trying to evolve the industry with a lens of safety and soundness, you get terribly excited about the opportunity to leapfrog legacy infrastructure. And our first principle here, of course, is we think about what it means to the startup community to advance, if they will, if you wanted to actually be a regulated entity without a lot of capital, without sort of compliance. One of the best things you can do is automate the way that the data is pulled and create that transparency and that dynamic pull. It gets you a lot farther down. And I think it's what Jim and John have both shared. Chuck, this is a moment of promise for the entrepreneurial community. If blockchain becomes a core tenet in which the regulators are comfortable with, it advances innovation in places right now that are stalled because they can't break through the regulatory, if you will, wall. I also want to point out something that maybe is also more akin to what your initial thought exercise was. And it strikes me that not all data on the blockchain actually needs to be kept private. I don't think anyone in the industry thinks it's a competitive advantage to have a room full of people doing sanction screening or KYC, as John said. Would this provide a vehicle for us to actually do in a way that is compelling and sensitive to privacy issues to let the industry come together in a pre-competitive way and think about blockchain as a way to share information and know your customer better, more fluently exchange information as bad actors go from institution to institution? And so I think there's another promise here on these regulatory environments. I naively bring that up. I know, Jim, you're probably cringing, but I do think that it's a terribly exciting future if we can find a way to smartly share data.
Well, Sarah, I mean, actually, I don't think that's. I'm assuming that I don't see Jim cringing, so I guess
Not at all.
Okay. Awesome.
Maybe you didn't.
I don't cringe
far
easily.
enough, then I guess it's not cringing. But the thing is, that idea is actually out there. If I'm not mistaken, one of the recent tech sprints that the FCA did, actually, I think second prize was a sharing mechanism where, you had Bank A and Bank B. Bank A knew that somebody was a human trafficker and Bank B had no idea. And then there were ways to sort of share that information while protecting sensitive data. It was actually a use case that was, I think it got second prize in one of the tech sprints. And I know there's work and discussion about that in the FinCEN space, specifically, when I saw the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, where they're actually trying to sort of have firms beef up their anti-money laundering, compliance, and risk assessment processes. One of the things that they mentioned, which I think was sort of an interesting little tidbit, was they actually want to have a working group to talk about collaborating with the industry. And so, it's like if you build it, they will come, field of dreams. So the thing is that, it's out there. And I think the thing that's interesting about our discussion here on the blockchain is that you have a mechanism to have this sort of real-time, highly transparent, protected way to accomplish this.
Yeah.
So
I think most of us, at least on this panel, agree that there's a lot of use case for this, but I also think it isn't all roses and unicorns. I think there's also, there is elements of folks that will push back against this concept and will think that, by having this supervisory node, it does to some extent eliminate the trust. Certainly distributed ledger technology is, the whole point of it is not having any kind of centralized source of central point of failure or contact or oversight. And so I think there's also an education that needs to happen in terms of pulling in industry and working collaboratively. And I think that's why some of this stuff is going to have to happen in baby steps, and it might take, certainly within permission blockchains or so within smaller groups. And but what's encouraging to me has been, some of the, the thought process around collaboration, around, especially with the regulators. You have offices of innovation now. You have the concept of sandboxes. So you're having some experimentation, dare I say, even with, on the regulatory side as well as the industry. But there really needs to be, I think that key word is collaboration and education to get there.
Yeah. Let me add one point to John's as well. And this is not meant to be negative, just realist. It's not all about the tech. It's not always about having better technology and the problems are solved, because there are real world problems that are not, solved by the tech, because there are legal, regulatory, all sorts of other things that have to be overcome to fix the problem. That's why I love John's analogy of baby steps, but collaboration along the way. So we don't turn this into, if we have a blockchain that can do X, Y, and Z, we're done.
Well, let's take a little dance on the dark side then, in terms of what those headwinds actually are. I was actually part of a conversation earlier this year with one of the companies that I'm working with, and I guess this concept came up, and it was along the lines of, well, not everybody's going to want to share. There are some firms, let's say large banks, for example, that see their scale and ability to sort of have these capabilities as a competitive advantage. I kind of think about it would be really interesting to kind of take all the community banks and turn them into this coalition that becomes their own monolith and ends up actually really creating scale in a way that does great things for those smaller banks. But I'd like to sort of go down the road a little bit, and I'd ask each of you to chime in. Jim, I'll start with you. What are the headwinds to adoption of something like this? Do you have a view? And again, look, I know it's your view and not the Fed. We have that very, very clear. So,
yeah, well, we're actually trying to answer the same question in fraud, because one of my other responsibilities is trying to reduce fraud in the U.S. and how do we do data sharing, and what are the impediments? In some cases, there are regulations about what you can and can't share, but I think sometimes those are solvable through things like zero knowledge proofs or other ways of thinking about what's the problem we're trying to solve. If I'm looking for a hit on an OFAC list, I don't need to see the data unless it's a positive hit. And so there's ways of thinking about sharing data only when you know it's a suspect transaction in that particular context. I think there really are legal liability issues. If data was shared and it was exposed through other parties, the primary owner of that data was still going to be liable in some way and or have reputational risk. And so they're going to, I would say, especially a larger organization, I understand, would say, why am I sharing this data if I'm not gaining, and I'm creating a legal liability for myself because now a third party has the data? Once again, that's where technology can help by saying, what is it that needs to be shared? It's not all the information necessarily about the transaction and the PII. Maybe it's only small pieces to be able to solve a problem or share that information about that bad trafficker or something else. So I think there are some legitimate reasons that sort of get in the way of sharing, but I don't mean I don't think they're unsolvable. I think it's just that we need the collaboration that we've talked about here, and some technology that allows some level of privacy while still helping to solve the problem.
Yeah. Other views?
Yep. Good, Sarah.
John and I both open our mouth at the same time. I can be quick, but I think mine is a much more practical headwind, and that's matching talent with industry experience. I think we have a talent gap here because the technologists who understand the development cycle don't have the breadth that John and Jim just expressed, right? The industry experience to bring it together. And I think we have some ways to go there where we create that link in a fluid way where we see the technology being deployed efficiently and with scale.
Yeah, I think a couple examples. So I think, one of the issues is around, consensus and who drives these issues around the technology, and the technology is so broad and has big implications. But one example is around the travel rule, right? So the basics of a transaction on a blockchain, you can't understand who the counterparty is, and therefore you can't track the necessary information similar to how you would if you were just sending a wire and knowing name and address and those data points around the party of that transaction. And this is an issue that's been around 7-8 years longer in terms of industry trying to figure out a way to just put this basic information within the protocols, and we still haven't gotten there yet. So, and I think a problem there is that there's so many different people attacking it, but nobody really owning it. And so that's one example. And then the other piece of it is the commercial nature of this, right? So we talked a lot about some of the bigger institutions. To me, one of the biggest use cases or functions of the blockchain technology is some of the back office uses around settlement and things like that. And so you look at interbank settlements, you look at the SWIFT network and things like that, payments in general. Now you're seeing a lot of these permission networks or use cases behind the scenes, which various small groups of banks clustering to do this and benefiting from a commercial standpoint. Unless you have someone to step in and make that a mandate to do that more broadly, people are going to benefit from the commercial standpoint, and so it's not going to get to that next level.
Yeah, one thing to add on that point to John's, which is a lot of times when you do have information sharing regimes around the world, it's regulated in. It's not that the industry decides it's the best thing to do. In some cases, you do. I know in the securities industry, there's a fair amount more there than in some others, but in the US, there's nobody that has the authority broadly to regulate payments. So even if I had the best idea in the world and I was benevolent, there's no one entity that has the power to do the regulation. I'm not saying we should, I'm just saying that's a situation that makes this a lot harder. So we normally have to convene and try to convince through collaboration as opposed to through a regulation. Once again, regulation can be a blunt instrument, but that's just the reality of other parts of the world versus here in the US. It's not always as straightforward.
So we had talked a few moments. I'm sorry, did I step on somebody? Good, sorry. Before we, I want to sort of flip back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier when we were in the AML, combating, terrorism financing realm. And Jim, I'm going to throw this to you in terms of regulatory node concept and the potential of the node actually performing AML and anti-terrorist financing and sanctions checks, and how would that work? And probably a variant of a theme that we've been talking about already. But why don't you elaborate on that and tell us a little bit about what that could be?
Sure. So Chuck, yeah, you mentioned that the Boston Fed's doing work with MIT, specifically the Digital Currency Initiative. So we're building a prototype central bank digital currency, not for production, but for technical research purposes. And if you think about that, one of the things that is very painful in the current payments business is AML sanctions, compliance, et cetera, various compliance obligations. Right now, that's on the backs of the banks. It's extremely challenging, expensive, a lot of risk, and/or Circle and other types of organizations for those money transmitters. But if you think of having a central bank digital currency on a ledger, then you can think about possibly AML and other compliance differently. Like maybe there is a single node that does all that work, which sort of sounds like a regulatory node. You know, be it FinCEN or just be it through some utility that the banks collectively support that allows one place where all those compliance checks happen. So that's a possibility. Like I said, we're not saying that's the answer or that's the long run solution, but that's the types of things we'll be checking out. What does it take to actually put a node in the network that does the AML, or is it need the banks on the front end, which is a whole different topography than having one node do it. So those are the kind of things that we're thinking about strictly from a technical possibilities perspective. And we've been talking to FinCEN, and they're very open to just talking with us, understanding what that would look like, and just wanting to see where innovation's possible within their world as well.
I'd sort of like unpack that just a touch, unless you're going to go into something that's still a little bit sensitive and new. But I can you like think about. You can have a regulatory node, let's say it's FinCEN, but still need to have inputs from various other node members and certain kind of protocols to sort of figure out how you pick up suspicious transactions. One of the things that back in my former life, which was sort of a frustrating kind of a experience, because I thought it really was kind of wasteful, was that, it would have been much easier. And actually FinCEN's making noise about this in this advance notice. Give me a sense of what you care about. Because otherwise, anything that we think could possibly be a criminal violation, we've had people running down, trying to figure out whether it's a suspicious transaction, and we're putting a lot of effort into trying to do that and get the form done. It's not a check the box form, as many of us know. And then if we decide not to, just to sort of cover ourselves, we then do the same process to justify why we didn't file one, and it seems sort of nuts. And so the question is that, can you envision, I don't know whether the conversations are going in this direction, where there's kind of like where there's a sort of like a serve that comes from, using a tennis analogy. So FinCEN serves out, look, I'm concerned about these issues. And they seem to be going down that road to kind of actually give guidance to where you actually have a handshake. I mean, has there been, how far have you gone in terms of talking about this, Jim? Is this sort of out there, or is this something that's got some legs?
Well, in the international community, it gets discussion just on different ways of thinking about it, because most everybody has some form of terrorist financing or money laundering regulations. We've not gone too deeply into it. What we're really trying to understand is if some entity other than, if a bank is responsible for all these checks like they are today, that means they have to see the transaction. So that's a certain network topology that may not be what a central bank digital currency should look like. If it's not the bank, that means the network itself has to have a certain amount of data such that you can do the check. And that data may be for no other reason than for the check itself. You may not need it for CBDC, but you only need it for AML. So we're just trying to answer those questions of what does this say about identity? What does it say about what intermediaries may or may not be part of the network? And then what does that all mean to throughput and connectivity and security? So we're trying to look at it broadly to understand how does that affect my architecture? How does it affect my technology, my cryptography? As I said before, though, if you had a node that's on this network, it may be that through zero knowledge proofs, all they see is exceptions that may be issues versus every single transaction that goes through the network. So we try to balance all those various things to come up with something that meets all of the various requirements that are pulling at each other on a system like this. So as I've said many times, we don't want to just pave the cow paths. We want to try to figure out what are you trying to do? We're trying to stop the bad guys. And everybody wants to do that and do it in a way that is more efficient, effective, and less costly. Can we find that? Can we find that or design that?
Yeah, this is the area that, I think it excites those of us that have been in the BSA space for years and been BSA officers. I mean, the technology cuts both ways. It can give you too much, or it can give you what you need. But really, you have the ability, right? So when it comes to tracking or looking for bad actors, all comes down.
So if I could just interrupt, we've got a question from the audience that I just wanted to read. So one of the big debates is whether a first-gen CBDC should be designed for wholesale use only, bank to bank to central bank, or also for retail use, physical cash in certain areas. So thoughts on the strengths and weaknesses of either approach, and then we'll get back to the topic of trust.
Okay, Jim, why don't you start with that?
Sure. So most of the experiments around the world, Boston, Singapore, Canada, Japan, have been in the wholesale side, mainly because it's a process that you can contain, I think, more easily from a proof of concept perspective. None of those are planning on going into production. It's just trying to understand the technology. What you find now is a move towards the retail side or general purpose CBDC. It's extremely complicated, but I think the rise of China going forward with theirs, the rise of Libra, just create, I think, more of a crunch to understand that market better. I think there's benefits to both, but I truly believe in the longest run, wire transfer systems work pretty well today, and they move quadrillions of dollars around the world. So it's not low-hanging fruit. I think in the retail space, you have more of an opportunity to put something in small scale, maybe not as small as the sand dollar for $48,000 of cap. But I think you have more of an opportunity to move in a smaller dollar amount and affect a lot of lives. One of the benefits I have to believe is part of the central bank digital currency for retail is the unbanked or underserved. I think that's an area where having a more easily accessible form of payment that is central bank funds could have a major social good in that particular area. So I think there's benefits in both, but I think wire transfer systems already are fairly bulletproof and work well. But I think on the retail side, there's a lot of opportunity personally.
Well, it actually ended up being a really good segue because going back to Sarah's cameo on the Mike Wise sort of trailer, talking about the importance of trust in the markets. And one of the things that I think should sort of motivate us all, I mean, it's great to have a great commercial solution, but are we improving lives? Are we creating more access to the unbanked? Are we making things better so that more people can sort of realize opportunity? And I know, Sarah, this resonates with you with your work with Vantage Ventures and sort of generating opportunity in what is lovingly known as flyover country. So Sarah, I'm going to sort of toss it to you because I know you're passionate about this. And do you see threads of development here that, along the lines of what we've been talking about, that could actually help realize those goals?
Yeah, I'm more encouraged having had a chance to sit with these guys and listen to all of you about where we're heading. Because I think, Chuck, you're right. If we think about the basic tenets of modern portfolio theory, what makes for a well-functioning market, number one is that we have a level playing field, that you and I have the same opportunity as the next guy to invest and make a return. And then more broadly, as that relates to economic prosperity and activity, that sense of hope and chance. And so my takeaway is that the introduction of new technologies that improve the regulatory environment, particularly as it relates to transparency and the use of data very wisely, actually lends itself to greater trust in our marketplace and in our economy. And I think it's a critical moment in time. It's pivotal that we figure this out for society. We don't have to look too far to see what happens when society ceases to trust an organized regulator. And so I'm excited by it, and I'm glad we're asking the question about, does this do a good job for all of society?
So I know we're getting close to time, and I want to end with a lightning round. So I want us to put in go back to the Back to the Future DeLorean, and we're going to go forward, about 20 years, and sort of put ourselves in the position of 20 years down the road when we're talking about blockchain, we're talking about central bank digital currencies. Nodes, real-time reviews. Give me about just a minute each in terms of what you think, if you got out of that DeLorean 20 years from now, what does the landscape look like? So Sarah, I'll start with you.
Oh, that's so unfair. I believe the world does look different in the sense that we have solved for the identity, the crisis of identity, and what enables individuals to more actively participate in our modern financial services sector. So my bet is that we actually have digitized identity, and it enables us to, with more frequency and less friction, transact amongst one another.
John?
All right, I'll try to take the DeLorean up to 80 miles per hour and see what I can do here. I think, what's really encouraging is, and I think 20 years is about right, because we're still in early days. We came at this, when I started, we were talking about payments use cases and reaching the unbanked and underbanked. And then we got into this wave of, ICOs and investments around, the use of digital currency. And really, we haven't really reached those really useful use cases yet. And I think that's where we're going. And so I think about changing people's lives. I think things like stable coins and certainly central bank backed digital currencies could help really have an impact in terms of how financial services are done, who they reach, financial inclusion issues, which I think are really critical. And then the blockchain technology itself, helping everything, not beyond financial services, doing a lot of things behind the scenes with settlement, with supply chain management, all those things, from a token economy to a really transaction-based, technology-based economy. I think it's really going to be interesting to see where we end up.
Jim?
Yeah, I agree with John. Nothing happens in 10 years. Innovation takes a long time. So on the wholesale side, I really see in a time when any major asset's going to be in a blockchain. And if you have an asset in a blockchain, that means you need money in a blockchain. So whether that's a finality type of network, stable coins, central bank digital currency of a wholesale nature, I think the assets without the money is very, very ineffective. And I think, to John's earlier point, I think all the back office operations will be integrated in a way that will be extremely efficient. I really hope that there is a retail version that allows those people left behind to actually be included in the financial industry. Not that banks haven't done a good job of being innovative and offering products, but I still think there's a group that the ROI isn't there, but still have a basic need for services that I think a CBDC or like product could offer.
So my own take at the sort of supplement what you guys said is that I think a lot of it's going to be driven by the removal of friction. Everybody's got smartphones. And I think about the Stellar network being able to move money for like $1,000,000th of a dollar. So a lot of this friction is going to go away. And I see real opportunity for inclusion. I see real opportunity for stability through some of the mechanisms that we're talking about today. Look, I guess we're close to time. This has been an awesome session. Sarah, John, Jim, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to kind of sort of just guide us through this discussion. And I learned a lot. It was terrific. And with that, thank you very much. And Mike, let me turn it back to you.
Great. Yes, awesome. I think 20 years from now, I'll be 78, which will be at that time the new 58, right? So I won't have aged at all, so that's good news. And then the talent gap that, Sarah, you mentioned between the tech and the industry is something that we on the board of the BBA and in the larger community are constantly talking about. How do we bring the tech savvy people in touch and in proximity to the business savvy people and get them talking together? And that's something that we're talking about a lot. So there's one question that we might want to ask, and that is, how would you define, and if we could just do a short answer on this, how would you define, and Jim, I'll ask you, how would you define a regulatory node?
Yeah, I really try to define it in broad terms, which is anybody who has a reason to have some sort of oversight of a particular network, and having real-time eyes on gives them that much more functionality. So as I said, it could be a regulator, it could be someone with rules enforcement, someone looking for fraud mitigation, or external auditors. So I think I use it generally to say anybody who has an oversight responsibility that can gain and do a better job because they're on the network.
Anybody else have, John, or anybody else want to comment on that question?
I think, Jim, you did a great job. Very
Not
comprehensive.
much to add to that.
Not much to add. Yeah.
That's it. Yep.
All right, great. Well, yeah, this has been such a great discussion. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating and for coming. We really appreciate it. So next up, we have next week, we're going to be co-hosting a virtual meetup with San Diego, with the San Diego Blockchain Association. So it's going to be coast to coast. And again, we want to thank our corporate members and sponsors. We're going to be trying a new thing. We've been rolling this out the last few BBA meetups, and that is the breakout rooms. So I'll just run down the list. These rooms are going to be posted in the chat window on the Crowdcast site. So room number 1 is going to be with Jim Cunha, talking about regulatory nodes and CBDC. Room number 2 is going to be with John Beccia and Chuck Senator, talking about reg tech, audit, and compliance. And room number 3, and that will also have John Hargrave and Sam Nathan, sorry. And then room number 3 is just general purpose networking for anybody that wants to join Lily Chen over there. So again, those rooms have been posted. You can just click through and we'll chat in there. So thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate it. On behalf of the Boston Blockchain Association, this has been a fantastic discussion. Can't wait to watch it again and again and really sponge out as much information as possible. Thank you so much on behalf of the Boston Blockchain Association. Thanks for joining, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Good panel, guys. Good seeing you.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John.
Okay.
See you in the room.
We're going to go in the room. Thanks.